This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with James Buckley his new book, Saving Congress from Itself. James Buckley has been a judge on the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. He was an Undersecretary of State in the Reagan administration, president of Radio Free Europe, and he was also a member of the United States Senate, where he was a candidate of New York's Conservative Party. James, so delighted to have you on the program to discuss this book.
Well, thank you for having me on your program.
The title of your book, Saving Congress from Itself, subtitle, Emancipating the States and Empowering Their People. So what's wrong here? Why doesn't Congress know what to do anymore? What's the problem that you've identified?
Well, the problem is that Congress has discovered a new kind of pork, which has focused a substantial part of its energies and its time on matters that are utterly unrelated to its constitutional duties, but instead focuses on the business of state governors and city councils. I'm referring to the vast number of programs that now exist which offer financing for activities that are the exclusive business of states and their subdivisions. I talk about things like urban planning, education, filling potholes, job training, urban development, all of those issues which, under the Constitution's 10th Amendment, are reserved to states and the localities, and which continue the Supreme Court continue to insist are the business of these states, are nevertheless now subject to a whole host of federal regulations that can add tremendously to their cost, distort state and local priorities, and remove decision-making from the control of the voters of the communities that are affected by these programs.
Now, when I think of large budgetary problems in the federal government, I mean, we don't lack for candidates. Now, how big is this problem, this grant and aid problem that you've identified? I mean, ballpark, portion of the budget, is this a significant part of the federal budget, or is this more of a problem of what it does to self-government as a practice?
Well, let me tell you how in my own experience, this has grown. Once Congress discovered this as the easiest way to scratch constituent backs. When I was elected in 1970, these programs spent $24 billion, and that's a lot of money. This coming year, they're going to spend $641 billion, or one out of every $6 spent by the federal government will go for purposes that are outside the constitutional business of the federal government. So that's a pretty huge amount of money.
A lot of, it is. It is a large amount, and I think you also identify other problems and other incentives that this offers Congress that takes them away from what you would think would be their primary deliberative role. Go ahead.
This is just the cash out of federal pockets. That's just the beginning of the expenses imposed by these programs.
So what does this do to state legislators, to governors, to mayors and city councils? I mean, you talk about the monetary cost, but there's also, you note, an administrative cost associated with this, but there's also a way in which this distorts local government.
Absolutely. When the federal government offers $3 for every dollar you spend for a purpose that appeals to a member of Congress who thought up the bill, there is a huge temptation to get that what is viewed as free money because it comes from Washington, but it is in reality the money which the taxpayers of the state sent to Washington in the first place. So it comes back with rules governing how it's going to be used, and layers of additional administrative costs added to the basic cost of the project being subsidized.
Now, when you just in thinking about the title of the book, "Saving Congress from Itself," a lot of scholars have noted that Congress no longer asserts its own interests against the executive branch. That it's, and we've seen this recently, I think, in painful detail. It's complacent and it's willing to be supine in the face of executive overreach or aggressive executive action. And indeed, it seems when we look at the IRS scandal, to take one example, they're not even very fearful that Congress can do anything to them. Is this tied into that process whereby Congress no longer sees itself as a muscular governing body, but as really an influence-seeking body? And when we look at the grants and aid, do we see that revealed?
Well, I think it's more that it's a distracted Congress. Over the years, it has assumed so many responsibilities that basically belong to the states that Congress is now on a treadmill. There's no time in the average day to think, to read. So you come up with massive legislation that no one has had a chance to study, that become law, and delegate responsibilities to federal bureaucracies, to devise what the exact rules that are going to apply. So it's a distracted Congress. It doesn't have the time to think things through. At the same time, we have emerged from what used to be citizen legislators to career legislators, and they're constantly trying to protect their chances for re-election. And that is what is the incentive for going to constituents and say, what is bothering you? And the constituent is not bothered about international relations, is not bothered by reforming tax codes. He's bothered about the local quality of the school, about job availability in the community. All of these kinds of concerns that once upon a time were the business of the people you elected at the state level and at the local level to look after matters that most directly affected you. That kind of a relationship has now been destroyed because you have to go all the way to a federal bureaucrat if you have a complaint about the conditions being imposed on the building a bridge next door.
You give two particular examples here from Connecticut. One in your own hometown, I think it was $500,000 to build a sidewalk near a school, which came out of a federal program to reduce obesity in school-age children, which somehow entailed building a sidewalk to the school. And then also, and these examples, right, are we can multiply them endlessly. An unneeded bus route between two cities in Connecticut, which in the case was certainly on no one's radar, and yet at the same time you've got, I think you listed 15 structurally deficient bridges in the state of Connecticut, but of course that ties into politicians wanting to get credit for big projects and not wanting, because no credit really on offer for fixing infrastructure. I think one of my questions is, I think this is tied to an argument running throughout your book, which is Congress finds this easier. It finds this mode of governing easier and in a way a surer route to re-election than actually being a deliberative self-governing body. Go ahead.
Yeah, it can avoid all the hard decisions. Yeah. Once you start talking about immigration, you have to take one side of the line or the other. But if you spend all your time worrying about community development in one small county in your state, that doesn't create any ripples, and the people in that community say, this is a great guy, he knows about us, and he wants to do something for us. So it's the easy way to seek re-election while avoiding the hard decisions that only Congress can handle and which have got to be resolved or we're going to bankrupt ourselves.
What if, let me play devil's advocate, what if we could fund a shockingly high number of these programs and, not have to seek borrowing? We could just, maybe a small increase in the tax rate or something like that. We could actually make this happen, and it's not something that we don't have the money for. Would it still be worth canceling them? I mean, what else does it alter in sort of the fabric of American government?
Well, it destroys effective self-government at the state level and the local level, because the people you elect at those levels no longer have the authority to decide how this bridge is going to be built or what improvements are going to be made in your school system or how you're going to look after your aged or your poor. Those decisions have been moved away from your control and your supervision to people in Washington whom you have no way of reaching and who do not know the particulars of your particular situation. You're substituting the judgment of academics for people with hands-on experience who have the knowledge of the local conditions and the local facts and who are can be held personally responsible for the quality of their discharge or their duties.
So now state legislators, state government gains tremendously also here. We've been talking a lot about Congress, but they're also gaining in the sense of, Michael Greve on our blog has endlessly made this point that they can receive credit for programs that they actually don't have to fund, that they don't have to raise taxes and spend and be transparent about, because the money is coming from all of these other states, all these other taxpayers from beyond their jurisdictions. So they're also gaining here, and so we're really seeing. We see how this is an intractable problem. I mean, all levels of government are colluding. All the players are in it, and it's, how you untie that is very difficult.
Exactly. And also, if something goes wrong, a state official could say, it's not my fault. I had to follow the instructions from Washington. So you can't hold them accountable for how they are spending for the projects that they are supervising. No, this is something where I think if we're going to have the fundamental reform, which I believe is absolutely necessary, is to get the people informed of the facts. I'm talking about an analysis of 50 years' experience with these programs, and they are increasing the cost to taxpayers and decreasing the taxpayers' ability to control what's happening in their own states and localities. So from the individual's point of view, the citizen's point of view, there's everything to be said for abolishing all of these programs at the federal level so that they can regain control over them and do the same job cheaper at the local level. And there's time and again in the past history, if enough people in the public get angry, get informed, get motivated, that can achieve political miracles at the governmental level.
This is go ahead. I don't know. I want to interrupt you.
And we have a recent example of where a device for securing votes, namely the earmarks, were finally stigmatized. And about 2 or 3 years ago, thanks to a couple of senators, they have now been abolished. So if we can start stigmatizing these programs as not only fantastically extravagant in the waste, but also as distorting the way we govern ourselves, it is, I think, in the long run possible to shame Congress into saying this is not our business. Let's get back to the serious work for which we were elected.
I want to talk in a minute about, you call it your modest proposal. It's really a grand proposal, and then some auxiliary precautions. I like your term there. That also should happen. However, in thinking about the people and the people being angry and upset, I mean, a couple of contradictory thoughts in my mind. One is they seem to like this. They seem to want this when something is built. I mean, I think if I live in a suburb outside of Indianapolis, there's talk of connecting 2 art districts with federal money, and people seem somewhat, or the press, and I haven't seen any major opposition yet formed to this, even though there's no market rationale for it, obviously. But I want to say, when does this stuff begin, this grant? And I mean, getting back to just the origins of it. I mean, 1970, when you're serving, it's $24 billion. It's grown tremendously since then. But what sets it off?
An unfortunate Supreme Court decision in 1937, which is interpreting something called the spending clause. The spending clause in the Constitution authorizes Congress to raise money through taxes and so forth, and spend it to pay off debts, and to advance defense, mutual defense, and advance the general welfare of the United States. The Supreme Court looked at those words, general welfare and authority to spend, and said that Congress had the ability to spend money to encourage purposes which lay beyond its own jurisdiction to enforce. In other words, it authorizes Congress to interest itself in activities where it is forbidden to pass laws. So all of these programs are to pass the Supreme Court muster must involve voluntary participation by the states. So it has established a system of bribery, and the bribes, unfortunately, are almost impossible to resist for the reason you suggested about these communities in Indiana, because money from the federal the Treasury is viewed as free, even though it originates in the taxes paid by members of federal taxes paid by people living in Indiana or here in Connecticut for that widening of sidewalks and so on. Or it is raised in money that our children and grandchildren are going to have to repay. So it is not cost-free, but the public doesn't realize that yet, which is why it's important to have programs like the one we're engaged in right now to begin that educational process.
You stress, I mean, you also talk about another case, a more recent case, South Dakota versus Dole, which basically says that the general welfare clause is not judicially administrable in terms of limits on what Congress can do, and so this also kind of authorizes these programs. Yet it does seem, I mean, I kind of see the court's point there, in terms of this is really something the court can enforce. This has to be done at the level of Congress restraining itself because it understands the logic and the structural logic of the Constitution. But it does seem democratically that particular logic has been swept away. It's only recently that we've seen, I think we've started to see movement towards your position in the guise of Obamacare, and you mentioned that in the book. We've got 23 or 24 states have refused to be a part of the Obamacare state subsidy networks. We've seen something has happened with the Common Core. I think Indiana is somewhat of a part of that. And then we've also got, I think an increasing awareness of just budgetary limitations as a whole. And there even seems to be a logic. I was recently at a Tea Party meeting here in the state of Indiana, and all of the heads of the Tea Parties seem to be talking more and more about the idea that these programs aren't good, even if you are being reimbursed. But for some of the reasons you talk about in the book, the administrative cost, the priorities, etc. So it seems to be this is happening at a level of self-government that this is starting to unfold in people's minds, that we are in fact running out of money. We aren't in the endless post-war situation of increasing economic growth, federal budgets, and also our demographics aren't working out so well either.
Yeah. But it's not only a question we're running out of money, because the federal government can keep on borrowing for at least a while longer.
For a while, yeah.
But it is a growing feeling of frustration when people on the scene are not allowed to address the problems they see in the way they believe will be most effective, because people in agencies in Washington have written rules that absolutely restrict their ability to do things in a sensible way. And that is beginning to go.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, as we think about that, though, and yet we are standing now, could be at the precipice of a backdoor way to have federal-funded daycare.
Yeah.
I mean, that was recently announced. It was, you see a lot of governors, I think, will probably line up for this under the guise of it's preschool education rather than what it actually will be. So it does go on. Talk about your modest proposal, as you call it, and then also some underlying structural things you want to institute as well.
Okay. Well, my modest proposal is that you abolish 100% of these programs. Each of them bears the costs. Each of them encourages the distortions that you and I have just been discussing. But because these grants have now risen, these transfers to the states have risen to a point where they amount to about 30% of the average state's revenues, you can't abolish the flow of money overnight. So my proposal is that you take all of the programs that the states and the subdivisions are currently relying on and convert them into single block grants, no strings attached block grants. Ship the money to the states and then let the states start spending them in their own way to meet those particular areas, road construction, education, you name it. And phase those transfers, those block grants, down over the next half dozen years, which would give the states and the federal government the time to readjust their respective tax codes so that the states have resumed the kind of money they need to pursue those programs they want to pursue in the manner in which they want to do them. The net effect on the taxpayer should be a reduction in taxes because of the enormous monetary savings that will be achieved as a result of that phase-out. And so that's my proposal, a simple proposal, and if adopted, it would at one stroke eliminate 1/6 of federal spending. 2, it would eliminate the excuse members of Congress now have from for not focusing on the critical problems that have got to be resolved if we're going to continue to be an effective nation. And thirdly, it will restore to the people in the states control over what is done in their own states on those matters that most directly affect them.
Now, you also list some auxiliary precautions you think will also be needed to carry this into effect, because block grants themselves, we've done that. Nixon started that. If I can just hear the voice of Michael Greve in my ear, block grants are not maybe not equally, but also tremendously distorting as well, and also allow the same sort of dynamic to go on in state governments and for state governing officials. And then also 6 years. It's interesting that you pick that number, but so what else needs to happen to make this possible?
Well, the problem is we're dealing with human nature, and so long as you have people elected to the Congress of the United States who see themselves as entering into a career that they expect to stay in that career until they die, then they are going to do all kinds of measures such as creating these programs to ingratiate themselves to constituencies and assure their reelection. And that is why I believe it is terribly important to have limits on the number of years that people can serve in the Congress. And so I would propose the constitutional amendment that limits service in the Senate to 12 years and service in the House to 12 years. That will change the mindset of the people where they're saying, I'm taking a leave of absence from my normal activities to serve the country, and my focus is going to be on what's good for the country and not what will ensure my own election. There is another aspect of this and something that we didn't mention in our discussion, an inordinate amount of time is now spent by members of Congress on the telephone begging for money to finance their next re-election, and they have to do that. I never did that during my time in Congress, because there was no limit on what an individual who believed in me was able to contribute to my campaign. So that when it came around to re-election time, I had a finance committee. They collected money. I didn't go out and beg for it, and I had enough to present my views and to allow the people in New York State to decide whether they want to re-elect me. They decided not to do it, but it's not because I didn't have enough money to tell them what I believed in and what I thought we ought to be doing. So that's my second suggestion. My third suggestion is the one that could solve all of these problems overnight, and that is to urge the Supreme Court to re-examine that decision that back in 1937. And that decision, a key part of it was that Congress could, yes, offer bribes, but it could not coerce the states into accepting the bribes. Well, the experience we have had since then is that these programs are inherently coercive, politically, because you're getting somebody else's money and using it, and that seems to be free. But another one, and tremendously important, is if you don't if the state and your city does not grab that money that you have sent to Washington through your taxes, it is going to go elsewhere. So there's a financial imperative as well to get back some of the money you sent to Washington. So in both instances, they have proven almost impossible to resist. Now, you mentioned earlier that 23 states have decided not to go along with the Obamacare exchanges. But I think that is an exception that proves the rule. The fact is, and this is let me the other example. I'm talking about the ones that have declined to expand Medicaid coverage, even though in the first 2 or 3 years, the federal government would pay 100% of the cost of that expansion. The states have had such a bad experience from the collateral costs that have resulted from the federal rules governing Medicaid, that they have decided that they simply are not going to compound those costs by expanding the coverage.
Yeah, no, you say it's the exception that proves the rule. One, it harkens back to this decision you're referencing, Helvering versus Davis. And in that, John Roberts indicated to the federal government, this is coercive, what you're trying to do with Obamacare and bringing the states into its network, and it's not going to be allowed. So that actually, I think, does prove your point in a very powerful way. But it is also the case that we're seeing states in a very powerful way form around economic interest and square off against one another. The red state versus blue state phenomenon. Although in a way, as I say that, it also brings us back to your core argument, which is red states are net takers of federal dollars here, and of grant and aid dollars. And so in a way, my question is, are these states with some more streamlined taxes and regulations, like Texas is the obvious one, a lot of southern states, they're actually able to do this because of what they're able to receive from the federal government. And this was one criticism raised of the former governor of Indiana, whom everyone liked for his budget-cutting prowess, Mitch Daniels, but that he was actually able to do this because of being very entrepreneurial about the money he brought into Indiana.
Well, if you got these programs in place, you're stupid not to milk them.
Yes.
But you have to recognize how damaging they are across if you add in all of the other costs, you're paying a huge price for the ability to do that. And yes, if my proposal is adopted, the states who want to continue with the same level of spending on this, that, and the other are going to have to find new ways of raising the money, and that might cause some states to decide to adopt income taxes that presently don't have income taxes. But the fact is, they are using income tax if they under the present system. The money that comes from the federal government is financed by federal income taxes, so their citizens are paying income taxes to take care of local needs.
On your proposal, I mean, just thinking about the term limits proposal, which it's hard to amend the Constitution, obviously, and we've also kind of seen this movie.
Not always if everybody wants it.
Well, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But we've seen the term limits proposal put forward before. I mean, I remember in the early '90s this call, and this was a part of the '94 Republican takeover. Was a term limit idea. At least a lot of them had this on their campaign slogans, and it kind of went nowhere. So my question to you,
wait a moment. We back up a little bit. The House of Representatives actually, following that election, they actually voted for a constitutional amendment limiting terms, but it didn't get the 2/3 vote for it that would be required to begin the amendment process. By the same token, a large number of states had adopted limits on the terms of the people they would send to Washington that were declared unconstitutional. So you can amend the Constitution not necessarily only by originating the amendment in the Congress, but originating it at the state level. And there is substantial public support. I think the last figures I saw was about 70% public support for term limits on Congress.
I mean, I suppose in your favor, one thing that has really emerged, and Angela Codavilla writes about this a lot, is the idea of a New York to Washington, D.C. ruling class, a corridor of power that's revolving. We've seen this in a very, very revealing way with officials in the Obama administration moving into Wall Street positions or moving from those positions into the administration, and just the whole idea of basically a Washington that is detached from the rest of the country. I can see this sort of public symbolism and imagery galvanizing a state-led process. But my question really, it kind of brings or harkens to something Chris DeMuth has been writing about recently. So short of a grand strategy or a grand proposal that you've put forward, he talks about how do you make Congress self-governing again, and what things could be achieved internally in the ways it's organized and rules itself, and he talks about actually making it hierarchical again. And I think one of his proposals is reviving a committee system that actually has seniority leadership, which in a way tamps down on this sort of all-access entryway into Congress, because the power is centralized in a few hands, which of course, you can see the good and the bad of that, but maybe the overall effect, he argues, this is one of several proposals, is that you actually have a Congress that has to contend with, real arguments again and has real or narrow gates to secure its favors, which as opposed to the present system, which he argues is more free-floating. But along those lines, it seems to be internal things that need to happen in Congress to really force it, both vis-a-vis the administrative state and also these grants and aid issues, to be self-governing.
There are things that can be done to make it a more effective body, but the problem still is that you have such a vast universe of matters that are now clogging the wheels of Congress, that it is physically impossible to do the job. You are in a trade. You don't have time to think. You don't have time to debate. You don't have time to go listen to whoever's speaking on the floor. You've got to thin down the agenda. And this is why I think my modest proposal would eliminate probably half of the stuff that people do in Washington.
And that's dangerous, though. That's incredibly dangerous to their interest. Thinking back, hearkening back here, a part of your proposal, the block grants. I mean, how you say block grants, but how does that process work? Is it something like Charles Murray proposed giving everyone, I think, maybe $10,000 as a maybe a year or something, give every American something like some lump sum package, and replacing all the welfare programs, which would eliminate all of the federal bureaucrats and all of those sort of transaction costs associated with it. But I think he did that more as just as a thought experiment, just to indicate how much money is spent. Is that
right?
But you're real here. I mean, this is something real here in terms of making this all a block grant for 6 years to every state.
Yeah. Declining the first year. Well, let's say the state of Indiana and its subdivisions are currently getting $50 billion from the federal government in transfers. That's just out of my head, the figure. Those $50 billion are comprised of 1,400 or maybe 1,000 grants, each with its own little ground rules, each for a specific purpose within the state. I'm saying continue for the first year to send $50 billion to Indiana, but with no rules attached to them. That money is to be spent the way the state believes is in the best interest of itself and its subdivisions. That's what I mean by strings attached. So the flow of money is continued, but how it is, the detailed instructions on how it is to be used are lifted away so that it can be used in a sensible manner, in a prudent manner, in accordance with the judgment of the people who are responsible directly to the people of the state.
I suppose one element in this, and as I listen to you talk, I mean, it's kind of obvious. Why do you still want to send your money to Washington if it's coming back to you directly? This is kind of pointless. I like the idea. I suppose the intangible here is the expert class. Those who create jobs for themselves, administering and thinking up the needs for these kinds of programs in the opposition that they mount, but also in a way their ability to, and I say this, and I think of the example of Jonathan Gruber in my mind, but the way they are still, we kind of snicker at the idea of the expert, and yet we still largely defer to them. And I don't know if that's just a problem latent within democracy itself, and that the people fail to trust their own judgment. But that sort of rules and stands over this whole process, that we somehow need these people to tell us how to live.
I'm not sure how popular an idea that is.
Yeah.
Well,
if you think about if you think about just coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, and the Dodd-Frank Act, you think about. There is this sort of sense that we actually really need these bodies, these governing bodies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, et cetera, to really step in and protect us. And I guess I just say that seems to be, even though we snicker at it, it does seem to be an impregnable thing.
Well, I think it's becoming quite pregnable. When you see all the recent headlines about the IRS, Veterans Administration, I think that people, the assumption that Washington necessarily knows best simply doesn't hold anymore. That myth has been undercut. And I believe that the average citizen no longer has this veneration for academic prowess. They'd rather see somebody they know who is on the scene, who understands the local facts to decide what is the best way to retar this road. Yeah.
No, and I suppose also in thinking about this idea of connecting people with their local officials, also working in your favor, it seems to me, is it's just sort of the amount of options that people have now, that, as opposed to, say, when this was really kicking into high gear, maybe with the Great Society and other plans. One, so we talk about the expert class maybe not being seen as so expert anymore, but also just the massification and centralization of life seeming to die away in the favor of having 20 or 30 different options for, every consumer choice that people make, et cetera. It seems to move us in the direction of the economy informing our political choice and apparatus as well.
Yeah, there was a very interesting analysis that came out just a few months ago of 2013 polling data, and it showed that very large majorities of Americans believed that a whole series of areas were best dealt with by state and local governments. There was something like roads, 80% could do it locally, locally. Education, 78%. Welfare, very substantial majority said, handle it where I can see it.
Yeah.
Don't have this remote government in Washington tell us how best to handle these responsibilities. So I think that the public sentiment now is strongly in favor of bringing responsibility home.
Mr. Buckley, I just want to say I hope that is true, and I wish you great success with your arguments in this regard. It seems probably another thing moving in the favor is the idea of course, this assumes that they actually do anything with it, is you have a Republican Party having more state legislative seats than it's had since, I think, 1920, which is in itself a fairly remarkable achievement, and perhaps a testimony to the states wanting to find existential space to be free of these edicts as well. It seems there's a opinion moving in that direction. We've been talking with James Buckley about his new book, Saving Congress from Itself, Emancipating the States and Empowering the People. His modest proposal, as he calls it, is for eliminating grants and aid programs, switching them to block grants for 6 years, and then eliminating campaign contribution limits largely, and also reinforcing, having a general welfare clause that actually means something and that doesn't allow Congress to end run around the other enumerated powers or largely sweep those powers away and its own duties and responsibilities. James, thank you so much for discussing your book with us today. I really appreciate it. Best of luck.
Thank you.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.